The frosty encounter. The crisp, icy breeze of late January swept through the town of Edgewater, a picturesque yet quietly divided community nestled against the sprawling pines of the North Ridge Forest. The streets bore a charm that spoke of history and modernity in equal measure. On one side, quaint shops with vintage awnings housed generations-old businesses, while across the street, sleek buildings of glass and steel hinted at the town's emerging ambitions. Yet beneath this surface of unity, an unspoken tension simmered. Amelia Dawson, an accomplished journalist and the wife of Edgewater's police commissioner, Thomas Dawson, stepped out of a cozy bookstore clutching a stack of carefully selected novels. At 32, her polished demeanor and warm smile often drew people's attention, but Amelia preferred a life out of the spotlight. She had always been her own person, never leaning on her husband's influential position for favors or recognition. As she crossed the cobblestone path toward her car, she noticed two uniformed officers loitering nearby. Their stern gazes locked onto her as she approached. Amelia offered a polite nod, but the officers didn't reciprocate. Instead, they stepped in her way, their postures rigid and unyielding. "Excuse me, ma'am," said the taller of the two, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. His badge read Officer Reeves. "We need to ask you a few questions." Amelia paused, her grip tightening around her books. "Of course. Is there a problem?" The second officer, shorter but no less intimidating, sneered. His name tag read Officer Hensley. "We've received reports of suspicious activity in this area. We'll need to search your belongings." Amelia blinked, taken aback. She glanced around, noting that the street was sparsely populated, with a few passers-by quickly averting their eyes. The cold air seemed to grow sharper against her skin. "Suspicious activity. I just come from the bookstore." Hensley crossed his arms, his tone turning accusatory. "Are you refusing to cooperate, ma'am?" The insinuation stung. Amelia straightened her back, her voice steady, but tinged with disbelief. "I'm not refusing. I'm simply asking for clarification." Without further explanation, Reeves stepped forward, reaching for her purse. Amelia instinctively pulled it back, her heart pounding. The scene drew murmurs from a distance, but no one dared to intervene. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. "This is standard procedure," Reeves snapped. "If you resist, we'll have to detain you." The words hung heavy in the frosty air. Amelia's breath hitched, a mixture of indignation and fear coursing through her veins. She knew that arguing could escalate the situation, but complying felt equally unjust. Summoning her courage, she placed her books on the hood of her car and held out her bag. The search was unnecessarily invasive, with Hensley rummaging through her belongings as if determined to find something incriminating. The indignity of the moment left Amelia feeling exposed and powerless. When Hensley found nothing, his frustration became evident. "You're sure you're not hiding anything?" he pressed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Amelia met his gaze, her composure unwavering despite the storm brewing inside her. "I'd like to call my husband." The officers exchanged skeptical smirks. "Your husband?" Reeves mocked. "Go ahead. We'd love to meet him." With trembling hands, Amelia retrieved her phone and dialed. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered, calm yet commanding. "Amelia, what's wrong?" Thomas's voice carried a mixture of concern and authority. "Thomas," she began, keeping her tone even though her emotions threatened to spill over. "I'm being harassed by two officers near the corner of Maple and 3rd. They claim I'm involved in suspicious activity." There was a moment of silence before Thomas's voice returned, firm and resolute. "Stay where you are. I'm on my way." Amelia hung up, her eyes never leaving the two officers. Reeves shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, while Hensley's confidence seemed to waver. The power dynamics of the situation were about to shift, and they knew it. 5 minutes felt like an eternity. The tension was palpable as a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. Commissioner Thomas Dawson stepped out, his imposing figure and sharp gray suit exuding authority. His normally calm demeanor was overshadowed by the storm in his eyes as he approached the scene. "Commissioner Dawson," Reeves stammered, his earlier bravado dissolving. "We were just—" "Silence," Thomas interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. His eyes swept over the scene, taking in his wife's distress and the officers' nervous postures. "Explain yourselves." Hensley opened his mouth to speak but faltered under Thomas's glare. "We received reports of suspicious activity," Reeves managed, though his tone lacked conviction. "Suspicious activity," Thomas repeated, his voice icy. "What activity? And how does my wife fit this so-called description?" Neither officer could answer. The crowd that had begun to gather watched in silence, their curiosity and unease palpable. Thomas turned to Amelia, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" Amelia nodded, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm fine now." Thomas turned back to the officers, his voice rising with controlled fury. "You humiliated and harassed a citizen, my wife, without cause. This is not just an abuse of power, it's a disgrace to the badge." Reeves and Hensley fidgeted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence reduced to fear. Thomas pulled out his phone, issuing a swift command to Internal Affairs. "Officers Reeves and Hensley are to be suspended immediately pending investigation. Make it happen now." The gravity of his words sent ripples through the crowd. The officers' faces turned pale as they realized the severity of their situation. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived to escort them away. As the officers were led off, Amelia stepped closer to Thomas, her hand finding his. The crowd murmured, their shock giving way to quiet admiration. Justice had been served swiftly, but for Amelia, the emotional toll of the encounter lingered. Thomas turned to her, his voice soft yet resolute. "I'm sorry this happened, Amelia. It won't happen again." She squeezed his hand, a small but determined smile gracing her lips. "I know, Thomas. Together, we'll make sure of it." As they walked away from the scene, the weight of the moment settled over the town. Edgewater's icy afternoon had thawed into a fiery call for change, and Amelia knew this was only the beginning. Ripples of change. The events of that icy afternoon in Edgewater reverberated far beyond the corner of Maple and Third. News of the confrontation spread quickly through the small town, where word of mouth was faster than any broadcast. By the next morning, conversations in cafes, on sidewalks, and in offices centered around one name, Amelia Dawson. The whispers were mixed. Some applauded the commissioner for standing up for his wife, for taking a public stand against misconduct. Others, particularly those in law enforcement circles, bristled at what they perceived as an overreaction. He threw his own officers under the bus. One patrolman muttered to his partner over coffee, "How's anyone supposed to do their job with that kind of scrutiny?" Amelia, however, woke that morning not to whispers, but to a heavy knot in her stomach. She had always cherished her privacy, valuing her independence even in the shadow of her husband's public role. Now, her name and face had become symbols of a deeply ingrained problem, something far bigger than her own humiliation. She sat at the kitchen table, stirring her tea absent-mindedly as sunlight streamed through the large bay windows. Across from her, Thomas read over reports with a furrowed brow. The local paper's front page was spread out between them, the headline bold and accusatory. "Commissioner's wife sparks controversy. Police misconduct allegations divide Edgewater." "They're making it sound like I staged the whole thing," Amelia murmured, her voice tinged with frustration. "Like this was all some ploy for attention." Thomas set down the papers and reached for her hand. "You didn't do anything wrong. You were mistreated, and the people responsible are being held accountable. Don't let anyone twist that." She nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. "I didn't ask for this spotlight, Thomas. I just wanted to live my life in peace." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe the spotlight isn't what we wanted, but now that it's here, we have an opportunity to make a real difference." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" He folded his hands on the table, his tone resolute. "I'm calling a town hall meeting. We're going to address this head-on. No more whispers, no more speculation. The community deserves transparency, and the police department needs reform." Amelia hesitated. She admired her husband's determination, but she also knew how deeply entrenched the problems were. "Do you really think one meeting will change anything?" "It's a start," he replied, "and it's better than doing nothing." The town hall was scheduled for the following Friday evening at Edgewater's historic community center. By the time Amelia and Thomas arrived, the hall was packed. Rows of folding chairs stretched to the back wall, and latecomers leaned against the sides of the room. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of anticipation, curiosity, and tension. Amelia's heart raced as she stepped onto the small stage beside Thomas. She had never been one for public speaking, but Thomas's steady presence gave her strength. He approached the podium, tapping the microphone to quiet the murmurs. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. "Thank you for coming tonight. As many of you know, my wife, Amelia, was subjected to an unacceptable experience at the hands of two of our officers earlier this week. What happened to her was not just a personal affront. It was a symptom of a larger issue, one that affects our entire community." The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of a chair. Thomas continued, his tone earnest. "Our police force is here to protect and serve, not to intimidate or humiliate. But when that trust is broken, it's not just the individuals involved who suffer, it's the entire community. That's why I've taken immediate steps to address this incident. Officers Reeves and Hensley are currently under investigation, and I am working with internal affairs to ensure accountability." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others crossed their arms, their skepticism evident. "But this isn't just about two officers," Thomas said, raising his voice slightly. "This is about a culture that allows such behavior to go unchecked. It's about systemic issues that we've ignored for too long. And it's about ensuring that no one in Edgewater, no matter their race, gender, or background, has to endure what my wife endured." Amelia glanced at the audience, her pulse quickening as she caught sight of familiar faces. Her favorite barista, her neighbor who always waved from her porch, the librarian who had recommended countless novels. All of them were watching, their expressions a mix of support and uncertainty. Thomas stepped aside, gesturing for Amelia to join him. She hesitated for a brief moment before taking the podium. Her voice was softer than his, but it carried a quiet strength. "I want to thank you all for being here," she began, her gaze sweeping the room. "What happened to me could have happened to anyone. And that's what scares me the most. We like to think of Edgewater as a safe, welcoming place, but my experience shows that we still have work to do." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame. I'm here to start a conversation. A real, honest conversation about how we can do better, as a community, as individuals, and as institutions, because I believe we can do better, and I believe that change starts with us." The room erupted in applause, though it was far from unanimous. Amelia could see pockets of resistance, men and women who shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying their reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths. As the applause subsided, Thomas took the microphone again. "We'll now open the floor for questions and comments. Please be respectful, and let's keep this productive." The next hour was a whirlwind of voices. Some praised Amelia's courage, while others voiced concerns about over-policing the police. A young black man stood up to recount his own experience with racial profiling, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. An older woman, a retired teacher, spoke about the need for better training and community outreach. Not everyone was supportive. A middle-aged man in the back accused Thomas of throwing good cops under the bus, prompting a ripple of murmurs. Thomas responded calmly but firmly, reiterating his commitment to accountability. Amelia listened intently, her hands folded in her lap. Each story, Each perspective added another layer to the complex tapestry of Edgewater's struggles. She felt a growing sense of responsibility, not just to herself, but to the entire community. As the meeting drew to a close, Thomas addressed the crowd one last time. "Tonight is just the beginning. We're forming a community advisory board to work directly with the police department on issues of reform and accountability. If you're interested in joining, please speak with my office. Together, we can build a better future for Edgewater." The crowd dispersed slowly, pockets of conversation lingering in the air. Amelia and Thomas stood by the door, shaking hands and thanking attendees as they left. Some offered words of encouragement, while others avoided eye contact altogether. By the time the hall was empty, Amelia felt both exhausted and invigorated. As she and Thomas stepped out into the cool night air, she turned to him with a small smile. "You were right," she said. "It's a start." Thomas wrapped an arm around her, his expression equal parts determination and pride. "And we're just getting started." They walked to their car under the glow of the streetlights, knowing that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time in days, Amelia felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that change, however slow and difficult, was possible. Little did they know, the events of that night would set off a chain reaction, one that would test their resolve and redefine the very fabric of their town. Seeds of resistance. The morning after the town hall meeting, Edgewater buzzed with discussions that ranged from heated arguments to quiet reflections. Some residents praised the Dawsons for their courage and transparency, while others criticized the commissioner for airing the department's dirty laundry in public. The divide was palpable, and tensions simmered beneath the surface. Amelia, now accustomed to the stares and whispers wherever she went, decided to step out for a walk. She needed to clear her mind and escape the four walls of their home, which had begun to feel more like a fortress. The brisk winter air nipped at her cheeks as she made her way through the quiet streets, her thoughts a whirlwind of uncertainty and determination. She passed by her favorite bookstore, its warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. The owner, a kind woman named Margaret, waved her inside. "Amelia, darling, come in. It's too cold to be wandering out there." Amelia hesitated but then stepped inside, welcoming the familiar smell of books and the hum of soft classical music. Margaret handed her a steaming cup of tea before gesturing to a chair near the counter. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Margaret began, her voice gentle but firm. "What you're doing, it's brave, but it's also dangerous." Amelia frowned, puzzled. "Dangerous? How so?" Margaret leaned closer, her expression grave. "You're shaking up the status quo, dear. People don't like change, especially when it threatens their comfort. There are those who will fight tooth and nail to keep things as they are." Amelia sipped her tea, the warmth doing little to dispel the chill that Margaret's words brought. "I'm not trying to threaten anyone. I just want fairness, justice." Margaret nodded. "And that's exactly why you're a threat. Be careful, Amelia. Not everyone in this town has your best interests at heart." Margaret's warning lingered in Amelia's mind as she returned home. She found Thomas in his office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. His tie was loosened, and his expression was one of exhaustion. "Busy day?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. Thomas looked up, his face softening at the sight of her. "Busier than usual. The fallout from the town hall is complicated." Amelia stepped closer, taking the seat across from him. "Complicated how?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There's resistance. Some officers are pushing back against the reforms. I've already received 2 resignations this morning. And there's more. Anonymous threats, whispers of a boycott." Her heart sank. "Threats? Thomas, this is serious." "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "But it's not unexpected. Change doesn't come without a fight. And I'm prepared to fight." Amelia reached across the desk, placing her hand over his. "We're in this together." Thomas gave her a small, weary smile. "I know, and that's the only thing keeping me going." That evening, as Amelia prepared dinner, her phone buzzed with a series of notifications. Curious, she checked the screen and found an influx of messages and emails. Most were supportive, words of encouragement from strangers and neighbors who admired her bravery. But amidst the positivity were darker messages, anonymous insults, veiled threats, and outright hostility. One message, in particular, made her blood run cold. It was an email with no subject line, the text simple yet chilling. "Stay in your lane, Mrs. Dawson, or you'll regret it." Her hands trembled as she set the phone down. The reality of the situation was sinking in faster than she could process. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival. When Thomas joined her in the kitchen, she showed him the email. His jaw tightened as he read it, his eyes flashing with anger. "I'll have this traced," he said, his voice hard. "Whoever sent this will face the consequences." Amelia shook her head. What if it's just someone trying to scare us? Reporting it might escalate things. "Amelia," Thomas said, his tone softening, "you shouldn't have to live in fear. No one should. We can't let them intimidate us." She nodded, though her unease remained. As they sat down to dinner, the weight of the situation hung heavy between them. The next day, Thomas called an emergency meeting with his senior officers. The atmosphere in the precinct's conference room was tense, the air thick with unspoken grievances. Some officers sat with their arms crossed, their expressions defiant, while others seemed unsure, their gazes darting between Thomas and their colleagues. Thomas stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding despite the resistance he faced. "Let me make one thing clear," he began, his voice steady but firm. "What happened last week was unacceptable. Officers Reeves and Hensley violated the very principles this department stands for, and they will be held accountable." A murmur rippled through the room, and one officer, a burly man named Sergeant McAllister, spoke up. "With all due respect, Commissioner, aren't you blowing this out of proportion? Those men were just doing their job." Thomas's gaze hardened. Was it their job to humiliate an innocent woman? To act on baseless suspicions fueled by prejudice? If that's your idea of policing, McAllister, then perhaps you're in the wrong profession. McAllister bristled but said nothing. Thomas continued, his voice unwavering. "We are here to serve and protect this community. All of it. If anyone here cannot uphold that mission, I suggest you hand in your resignation now." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Slowly, one officer stood, placing his badge and gun on the table. Others followed, their actions a silent protest against the changes Thomas was implementing. By the end of the meeting, 5 officers had walked out. Thomas watched them go, his heart heavy, but his resolve intact. He knew this was only the beginning of the battle. Meanwhile, Amelia took her first steps toward community activism. Encouraged by Margaret and a small group of supportive neighbors, she began organizing a forum for residents to share their experiences with law enforcement. The goal was simple: to foster understanding and accountability on both sides. The forum was held at the local library, its modest meeting room filled to capacity. People of all ages and backgrounds came forward to speak, their stories a tapestry of pain, resilience, and hope. Amelia listened intently, taking notes and offering words of encouragement. One story, in particular, struck a chord. A young woman named Jasmine recounted how her brother had been wrongfully arrested and beaten by police years ago. The case had been swept under the rug, and her family had never received an apology. "I just want to believe that things can get better," Jasmine said, her voice trembling. "That people like my brother won't be forgotten." Amelia's eyes filled with tears. "They won't be," she promised. "We won't let them be." As the forum concluded, Amelia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a victim of injustice. She was becoming an agent of change. And while the road ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't stop fighting, no matter how deep the resistance ran. Little did she know, The battle for justice in Edgewater was about to take an even darker turn. The shadow of opposition. Amelia woke to a gray sky, the kind of overcast morning that seemed to reflect her internal turmoil. The events of the past week had thrust her into a position she had neither sought nor desired. Yet, as she stared out the window at the quiet streets of Edgewater, she realized that stepping back was no longer an option. The cracks in the community's facade had been revealed, and pretending they didn't exist would only allow the rot to spread. Downstairs, Thomas was already immersed in work. He had been up late the previous night, poring over reports and meeting minutes. His usual composed demeanor seemed stretched thin, and the faint dark circles under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. "Morning," Amelia said softly, stepping into the kitchen. Thomas looked up and managed a tired smile. "Morning. Coffee's fresh." As she poured herself a cup, she noticed the stack of files on the table. More resignations. Thomas nodded grimly. 3 more officers quit overnight. McAllister is rallying them against me, stirring up resentment. Amelia frowned. Resentment? For what? Expecting them to do their jobs with integrity. "That's the problem," Thomas said, rubbing his temples. "For some, this isn't just about integrity. It's about power. Their power, and they don't want to lose it." Amelia sat across from him, her coffee forgotten. "What can we do? It feels like we're fighting a hydra. For every step forward, 2 more problems surface." "We keep going," Thomas said firmly. "We don't let them wear us down." But as resolute as Thomas sounded, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was brewing beneath the surface. Later that day, Amelia received a call from Margaret. "Amelia, have you seen today's paper?" Margaret's voice was tight with concern. "No. Why?" Amelia asked, her pulse quickening. "You might want to sit down before you read it." Amelia rushed to the front porch, where the local paper lay folded in its plastic sleeve. She unwrapped it hastily, her eyes scanning the front page. There, in bold letters, was the headline: "Community divided. Commissioner's actions spark controversy. Claims of bias arise." The accompanying article was a mixture of fact and insinuation. While it recounted the incident involving Amelia and the subsequent town hall meeting, it also quoted anonymous sources within the police department accusing Thomas of overstepping his authority and unfairly targeting officers. One particularly damning quote read, "The commissioner is prioritizing his personal agenda over the safety and morale of his force." Amelia's hands trembled as she read the piece. It was clear that someone, likely McAllister or his allies, was orchestrating a campaign to undermine Thomas's leadership. Fuming, she called Thomas, who was in a meeting at the precinct. When he answered, she could hear the tension in his voice. "Amelia, can this wait? I'm in the middle of." "No, it can't," she interrupted. "Have you seen the paper? They're smearing you, Thomas. They're calling your integrity into question." There was a pause before he sighed. "I figured this would happen sooner or later. McAllister and his cronies are desperate. They're trying to turn public opinion against us. We can't let them get away with this," Amelia said, her voice shaking with anger. "This is more than just a smear campaign. This is an attack on everything we're trying to accomplish." "I know," Thomas said quietly, "but we need to be strategic. Fighting back recklessly will only give them more ammunition." Amelia knew he was right, but the idea of staying quiet while their opponents spread lies felt unbearable. "What can I do?" she asked finally. Thomas hesitated before replying. "Keep building support. The community forum was a good start. We need more people to speak out, more voices advocating for change. That's how we'll win this." Over the next few days, Amelia threw herself into community organizing with renewed vigor. She partnered with local activists, business owners, and faith leaders to create a coalition called Voices for Justice. Their mission was simple: to advocate for transparency, accountability, and fairness in Edgewater's institutions. The coalition's first major event was a candlelight vigil for victims of police misconduct. Held in the town square, the vigil drew a diverse crowd. People held flickering candles as speakers shared their stories, their voices rising against the chill of the night. Amelia stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. For every story of injustice, there was a story of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, people could find strength. As the vigil drew to a close, Margaret approached her. "This is beautiful, Amelia. You're making a real difference." Amelia smiled faintly. "I hope so. But sometimes it feels like we're barely scratching the surface." Margaret placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It's a marathon, not a sprint." But not everyone was supportive of Amelia's efforts. Anonymous threats continued to flood her inbox, each one more disturbing than the last. She began to notice unfamiliar cars parked near her home and shadowy figures lingering on her street at odd hours. One night, as she was locking up the house, she spotted a figure standing at the edge of her driveway. Her breath caught, and she froze, her heart pounding. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching her. Gathering her courage, she flipped on the porch light and called out, "Who's there?" The figure turned and walked away without a word, disappearing into the shadows. Shaken, Amelia called Thomas, who rushed home immediately. "They're trying to scare us," he said, his jaw tight with anger as he checked the locks and windows. "But it won't work. We won't let it." Amelia nodded, though fear clung to her like a second skin. "Promise me we'll be careful, Thomas. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," he said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "We'll get through this together." The next morning, Amelia awoke to find her car vandalized. The windshield was shattered, the tires slashed, and the words "Stay quiet" spray-painted across the hood. It was a brazen act, one meant to send a clear message. Thomas called the precinct to report the incident, but Amelia could see the frustration in his eyes. "This isn't just intimidation," he said. "This is escalation. Whoever's behind, this isn't going to stop unless we stop them first." As the police photographed the damage and took statements, neighbors gathered to offer their support. One elderly woman, Mrs. Jenkins, shook her head sadly. "I've lived in this town my whole life, and I've never seen it like this. What you're doing is important, Amelia. Don't let them scare you." Amelia thanked her, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest. The line between activism and survival was growing thinner by the day, and she knew that the battle for justice in Edgewater was far from over. Little did she know, the opposition's next move would push her and Thomas to their limits, forcing them to confront not only their enemies, but also the depths of their own resolve. Fractured alliances. The vandalism of Amelia's car marked a turning point in the escalating tension within Edgewater. The quiet hostility that had simmered beneath the surface now erupted into blatant acts of intimidation. For the first time, Amelia and Thomas realized that they were not just facing institutional resistance. They were standing against a deeply entrenched network of power and fear. Thomas wasted no time addressing the incident. He called an emergency press conference, where he stood flanked by supportive officers and community leaders. Amelia watched from the sidelines as her husband spoke with unwavering conviction. "This act of vandalism is not just an attack on my family. It is an attack on the very principles of justice and accountability," Thomas declared, his voice steady but filled with righteous anger. "To those responsible, know that you will be held accountable. And to the people of Edgewater, I promise you this: our work will not be deterred. We will continue to fight for a better, fairer future." The room erupted in applause, but not everyone in the crowd was on their side. At the back of the room, Sergeant McAllister stood with a small group of disgruntled officers, their arms crossed and faces set in stony defiance. Their presence was a reminder of the growing divide within the police department, a divide that Thomas knew could fracture the institution entirely if left unchecked. That evening, Amelia hosted another meeting for Voices for Justice at the library. The room was packed, with standing room only as residents gathered to share their stories and discuss next steps. But even amidst the supportive crowd, Amelia couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. Margaret, ever the voice of reason, leaned in and whispered, "You're doing good work, Amelia. Don't let the threats get to you." Amelia nodded, forcing a smile. "I know. It feels like we're fighting a monster with endless heads. Every time we make progress, something else rears its ugly head." Margaret squeezed her hand. "That's the nature of change, dear. It's messy, uncomfortable, and often dangerous. But it's also worth it." As the meeting continued, a young man named Alex stood up to speak. His voice trembled as he recounted his experience with police harassment, but his words were laced with determination. "I used to think speaking out wouldn't make a difference," Alex said, his gaze sweeping the room. "But seeing all of you here tonight gives me hope. If we stand together, maybe we can change things." The room erupted in applause, and for a brief moment, Amelia felt a flicker of hope. But as the meeting ended and people began to file out, her phone buzzed with a new email. She hesitated before opening it, her stomach churning with dread. The message was brief but chilling. "We know where you live. Stop now, or else." Amelia's hands trembled as she showed the email to Margaret. "It's getting worse," she whispered. "I don't know how much more of this I can take." Margaret's expression hardened. "You need to report this. Every single threat. Don't let them silence you." Thomas was furious when Amelia showed him the email later that night. "This isn't just intimidation anymore. It's stalking. They're escalating, and we need to take this seriously." He immediately forwarded the email to the precinct's cybercrime unit, demanding an investigation. But even as he took action, Amelia could see the strain in his eyes. He was carrying the weight of not just their safety, but also the entire fight for reform. "What if they come after you, Thomas?" Amelia asked, her voice breaking. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you." He took her hands in his expression resolute. "We're in this together, Amelia. I won't let them scare us into giving up." The following day brought another unexpected blow. Thomas received a tip from an anonymous source. Someone within the police department had leaked confidential documents to the press, painting him as a tyrannical leader who had lost the trust of his officers. The leak included internal memos about the reform initiatives, taken out of context to make Thomas appear reckless and authoritarian. The headlines were brutal. "Commissioner under fire. Is reform coming at too high a cost?" The accompanying article quoted several unnamed officers who accused Thomas of destroying morale and turning his back on his own team. Thomas's phone rang incessantly as reporters sought comments, while Amelia fielded messages from concerned allies. The leak was a calculated move, one designed to undermine Thomas's credibility and sow doubt among their supporters. "This is McAllister's doing," Thomas said, pacing their living room as he reviewed the article. "He's trying to rally the department against me. If he succeeds, it'll be nearly impossible to push through the reforms." Amelia watched him, her heart aching at the toll this was taking on him. "What can we do? How do we fight back against something like this?" Thomas paused, his gaze sharpening. "We double down. We show the community why these reforms are necessary, and we expose the people trying to sabotage them." Meanwhile, the division within the police department grew more pronounced. Officers loyal to Thomas found themselves ostracized by their peers, while McAllister's faction grew bolder in their defiance. Rumors of a coordinated walkout began to circulate, threatening to cripple the already strained force. One of Thomas's most trusted allies, Lieutenant Sarah Vega, approached him with a warning. "Commissioner, I've been hearing whispers. McAllister is planning something big. He's rallying his supporters, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's behind the leaks." Thomas nodded grimly. "Keep an eye on him, Sarah, and let me know if you hear anything concrete." But McAllister was careful, operating in the shadows to avoid direct confrontation. His tactics were insidious, sowing fear and mistrust among the ranks, while continuing to undermine Thomas's leadership at every turn. As the tension reached a boiling point, Amelia found herself at the center of a new controversy. A local blogger, known for sensationalist and inflammatory content, published a scathing piece accusing her of using her husband's position to push a radical agenda. The article was filled with baseless accusations, but it quickly gained traction on social media, fueling the growing backlash against the Dawsons. Amelia tried to ignore the noise, focusing instead on her work with Voices for Justice, but the attacks were relentless, and the pressure was beginning to take its toll. She started sleeping less, her mind racing with worry about their safety and the future of their efforts. Thomas noticed the change in her. One evening, as they sat in the living room, he reached over and took her hand. "Amelia, you don't have to carry this alone. We're a team." She looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I know, but sometimes it feels like the whole world is against us." He pulled her into a tight embrace, his voice firm but gentle. "Let them come. We've faced worse, and we'll get through this too." As the days passed, the Dawsons prepared for what they knew would be their greatest challenge yet. The resistance they faced was formidable, but so was their resolve. And as the cracks in Edgewater's facade grew wider, the seeds of change continued to take root. But even as they pushed forward, a shadow loomed over them, a reminder that their fight for justice was far from over. And the next move by their opponents would test not just their courage, but also the very foundations of their beliefs. The battle for Edgewater. The final chapter of Amelia and Thomas Dawson's struggle for justice in Edgewater began with a morning that felt eerily still. The air was heavy with the anticipation of something imminent, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Amelia awoke early, her mind restless, and her heart weighed down by the mounting challenges. Despite her exhaustion, she knew she couldn't stop now, not when they had come so far. Thomas had already left for the precinct, where tensions were nearing a breaking point. The police department was fractured, with loyalties divided between those who supported reform and those who resisted it. The walkout Thomas had feared was no longer a rumor. It was a very real threat that could cripple the force and plunge Edgewater into chaos. At the precinct, Thomas stood in his office, staring at a list of names on his desk. These were the officers who had submitted formal resignations or had been implicated in the ongoing investigation into misconduct. The list was longer than he had anticipated, and each name felt like a blow to the department he had spent years trying to lead with integrity. Lieutenant Sarah Vega entered, her expression grim. "Commissioner, we have a situation." Thomas looked up, his jaw tightening. "What is it?" "McAllister's faction has organized a protest," Sarah said. "They're rallying outside the precinct as we speak, and they're not alone. Several community members have joined them." Thomas felt a surge of frustration. Community members? Why would they support this? Sarah hesitated before replying. "They've been fed lies, sir. McAllister's group is spreading a narrative that the reforms are weakening the department and putting the town at risk. People are scared, and fear makes them easy to manipulate." Thomas nodded, his expression hardening. "We'll address it, but we need to stay focused. Have we made any progress on identifying the source of the leaks?" "Not yet," Sarah admitted, "but I have a feeling McAllister is behind them. We just need proof." Outside the precinct, the scene was chaotic. A crowd of protesters had gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans against the reforms. Some signs read "Support our officers" and "Stop politicizing policing," while others were more personal, attacking Thomas directly. Amelia arrived just as the protest was gaining momentum. She had come to meet Thomas, but the sight of the crowd stopped her in her tracks. Her presence did not go unnoticed. Several protesters pointed at her, their expressions ranging from disdain to outright hostility. "That's her," someone shouted. "The commissioner's wife. She's the reason this is happening." Before Amelia could react, a small group of protesters approached her, their voices loud and accusatory. "You've turned this town upside down," one woman yelled. "My husband's out of a job because of you." Amelia tried to respond, her voice calm despite her racing heart. I'm sorry for what your family is going through, but these reforms are about ensuring fairness and accountability." "Don't give me that," another man interrupted. "You don't care about fairness. You just want to tear down the police." The confrontation was growing heated, and Amelia knew she needed to de-escalate. She raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "I understand your frustration, but please believe me when I say this isn't about attacking anyone. It's about building a better future for everyone." Her words were met with a mix of skepticism and anger, but before the situation could escalate further, Thomas emerged from the precinct, flanked by Sarah and several other officers. His commanding presence immediately drew the crowd's attention. "Enough." Thomas's voice cut through the noise like a blade. The protesters fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. Thomas stepped forward, his expression resolute. "I understand that many of you are upset. Change is never easy, and it often brings discomfort. But let me be clear. These reforms are not about tearing down the department. They are about rebuilding trust, ensuring accountability, and making this town safer for everyone." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I know some of you feel betrayed. I know there are those who believe these changes are a mistake. But ask yourselves this: what kind of community do we want to be? One that turns a blind eye to injustice, or one that faces it head-on?" The crowd murmured, some nodding while others remained defiant. McAllister, who stood near the back of the group, crossed his arms and scowled but said nothing. Thomas continued, his voice steady. "To those of you who have legitimate concerns, my door is always open. Let's have a conversation. Let's work together to find solutions. But I will not tolerate fear-mongering, intimidation, or lies. If you truly care about this town, then join me in making it better." The protest began to disperse, though not without lingering tension. McAllister and his allies retreated, their plans temporarily thwarted but far from defeated. Amelia watched them go, her heart heavy, but her resolve unshaken. Back inside the precinct, Thomas and Amelia regrouped with Sarah and other key allies. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a shared sense of determination. "We've got to find a way to counter their narrative," Sarah said. "The longer McAllister controls the story, the harder it will be to win people over." Amelia nodded. "We need to amplify the voices of those who support the reforms. The community forums have been powerful, but we need something bigger, something that reaches everyone." Thomas leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. A town-wide broadcast. A live event where we lay everything out, the reforms, the misconduct investigations, the steps we're taking to rebuild trust. "It's risky," Sarah said, "but it might be our best shot." The broadcast was scheduled for the following week, and the days leading up to it were a whirlwind of preparation. Thomas and Amelia worked tirelessly, crafting their message and rallying support from community leaders. Meanwhile, Sarah and her team intensified their investigation into McAllister's activities, determined to uncover the full extent of his sabotage. On the night of the broadcast, the community center was packed. The event was streamed live to ensure maximum reach, and Amelia felt a mixture of nerves and determination as she took her seat beside Thomas on the stage. Thomas began the broadcast with a heartfelt speech, outlining the vision behind the reforms and addressing the challenges they have faced. He spoke with passion and conviction, his words resonating with many in the audience. Then, one by one, community members shared their stories. Alex spoke about his experience with harassment, while Jasmine recounted her family's struggle for justice. Their testimonies were raw and powerful, cutting through the noise of misinformation and fear. Finally, Amelia took the stage. She spoke from the heart, her voice steady, despite the weight of the moment. "This fight has never been about me or my husband," she said. "It's about all of us. It's about creating a community where everyone feels safe, valued, and respected. That's not a radical agenda. It's a fundamental right." Her words were met with thunderous applause, and for the first time in weeks, Amelia felt a glimmer of hope. The broadcast marked a turning point in the battle for Edgewater. While the road ahead remained fraught with challenges, the tide was beginning to shift. McAllister's influence waned as his actions were exposed, and more officers began to rally behind Thomas's leadership. For Amelia, the journey was far from over, but she knew they had taken a crucial step forward. As she and Thomas walked home that night, hand in hand, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. "We did it," she said softly. "At least for now." Thomas nodded, his expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "We'll keep doing it, Amelia, one step at a time." The road to justice was long and arduous, but they were determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Together, they would continue to fight for the community they believed in, planting seeds of hope and change that would one day bloom into a better future for Edgewater.